everyone! In today's session, we're going to learn about Flask, which is a microweb framework that's written in Python. So, in this live session, first we'll just cover an introduction to Flask, including features of Flask, technologies that can connect to Flask, and much more. Then, we'll do an interactive demo to show you how to install it, and even we'll make our own dynamic web application, covering everything you'll need to know in order to create your own awesome Python-based web application. So first, let's go over what Flask actually is. So like I said before, Flask is a lightweight micro-web framework that's written in Python, and it's great to make web applications with. It's a micro-framework that doesn't include an ORM, or an Object Relational Manager. I'll elaborate that by saying Flask is just an add-on to Python so that you can create web applications with it. There are many cool Flask dependencies and libraries that you can add to Python to make really awesome web applications, and we'll go over all of the best ones in the demo. So here are some features that Flask provides. First, it has a built-in development server, which just means that it can facilitate many different services like unit testing, a runtime environment, and even software utilities for debugging if you use a virtual environment, which we'll go over in the demo. It also has Jinja 2 templating, and I'll tell you what that means in a second. It has a lightweight and modular design, like I said before, and since it's written in Python, it has a very easy integration with Python, and you can connect regular Python code to Flask and connect it to your web application. So now that we know what Flask actually is and some features that it has, let's compare Flask to PHP. So if you already know Python, then Flask is much easier than PHP to learn, but if you're a beginner to Python, then any one of them is fine. So as of now, for popularity, PHP is a much more popular language to do web applications than Flask. But Flask is also growing in popularity these days because it's a very new technology, while PHP has been around for over 30 years. Like I said before, Flask is a very new technology, so the community is also very small, while PHP has been around for a long time and it's a very old technology, so the community is very large for PHP. And finally, integrations. Since Flask is written in Python, the integration with Python is so easy because you can connect regular Python programs to your web application. And PHP has an easy integration with Apache Server. So now that you know all about Flask, let's actually get to the interactive demo and code our own dynamic web application. So the first thing I want to do is actually do all the installations. So I'll go to Terminal here, and I'm in the same folder with all of my web application and Python file, and we'll explain that later. But what I want to do is create a virtual environment. And what a virtual environment does is it keeps all of your packages and dependencies all in place and organized. So the way you can make a virtual environment on Mac is by saying Python 3 minus m venv for virtual env, which is environment, and then the name of the virtual environment. I'm going to call mine work. So it'll take a second and then it should create it. And there we go, it created it. But now I want to activate that virtual environment so that we can actually put all our dependencies inside. So to activate it, I'm going to say source work, which is the name of my virtual environment, /bin/activate. And then, as you can see, it activated, and you know it activated because it shows work in parentheses here. Alright, so let's clear the screen, and now we can actually install all the dependencies that we need. But we'll do that later. First, I'm going to go back to Atom so that we can actually code our web application. So as you can see, I have a file called application.py, and the reason why it's called that is because most Flask applications are called application.py or just app.py. So the first thing we have to do in this Python file is import Flask. So actually, from Flask, import Flask. And this is case sensitive, so it needs to be uppercase like that. And the next thing we want to do is initialize our Flask app. So I'm going to create a variable called app, which we can use later in the code. And for the value, since I'm making a Flask app, I want the Python file to know that. So I'm going to use this Flask function that I imported here. And then underscore underscore name underscore underscore. And what that does is it tells the Flask application that this is the file, this is the main file that I want to use for my Flask application. And then we can save this, and now we can continue on our Flask app. So Flask pages are separated into different things called routes. And this is kind of like different pages on a website. So each route redirects you to a different web page in our Flask app. So let's make the first route by saying app.route, and then here we can say slash, because slash is just the main route. And for the main route, I'm going to define a function, and we're going to call this index, because this is going to be like an index.html type thing, even though we're not actually doing HTML yet. So here, and then I'm just defining this variable. And then we want to return something. So let's define what we want to return. Maybe we want to return a string, so I'll say hello world. There we go. So before we can actually run this program, actually first let's save it, and then before we can actually run this program, we're going to have to install Flask and also a few other dependencies. So I'm going to say, since I'm already in my virtual environment, so all of the dependencies will be managed by our virtual environment. So I'm going to say pip install Flask. And if I ever look up, that's because I'm on a monitor. So it's saying collecting Flask, and it's installing, and there we go. So let's clear this, and we're also going to install Click. And you'll see why in a bit. This is for later, but we'll still install it. So here it installed all the dependencies that we needed. And the next thing we want to do before we can run it is, let's go back to Atom. So as you can see, we have application.py, and that's the Python file that I want to be the application. So we actually have to tell Flask that this is the Python file we want to use, just in case there's any other Python files. So I'll say set Flask underscore app equals, and then application.py, which is the Python file. But if you called your Python file anything else, then you would have to write that. So application.py. There we go. And there we go, it set the Flask app as application.py. And now this code is ready to run. So how I'm going to actually run this code is by saying Flask run. And then as you can see, it ran, and it's saying running on HTTP and then this IP address. So I'm just going to copy this IP address and then go to my Chrome browser. And if we paste in this, then it should open, and there we go. It opened up a web page that says hello world, and hello world is the same text that we inputted here. So if we want, we can change it. It's not just for hello world. So I can say hi there. There. And then if I save this and then go back to terminal, so to stop running it, I have to press Control-C, not Command, Control, and then Flask run again, just to run it again. And since it's the same IP address, we can just reload this. And there we go, it says hi there. And there we go, that worked. So that's the first step in making a web application. The next step, however, is to make a different route. So as you can see, this is the first route, which is the default route, just slash. So if I go to Google Chrome here, then it runs on this IP address. But if I did slash, like for example Rishab, then it gives us a not found. But if I wanted to give me a different text when I say slash Rishab, just like in a different website, we can make another route. So I'm going to copy this route here, and then paste it down here. And instead of slash, it should be slash Rishab, because I want the user to type slash Rishab, the IP address, and then slash Rishab. And we're going to make a different function. Let's call this function Rishab. And instead, I can say, hi Rishab, how are you? And then if we save this, Then let's press Ctrl C and clear this. And then Flask run again. And it's on the same server. So if I go back to the regular server, then it says hi there. But if I do this and then /Rishab, then it should say, there we go. Hi Rishab, how are you? And that's the same exact text that we inputted here. That worked. And the next thing we have to do is render an HTML page in our web application. So I actually have an index.html file right here, and this is actually not in the same folder. So here's the folder structure. I have my parent folder here called code, but you can call it whatever you want. And then I have my app.py in the parent folder. And then I have a templates folder, and then inside that templates folder is index.html. And this folder has to be called templates because Flask purposely looks for a folder called templates so that can be the HTML file it wants to render. So to actually render this HTML file, actually first let's actually write the HTML file. So I have HTML here, and for the title let's call it my web page. And let's just make an h1 tag. This is going to be a very simple HTML page, but you can add as much as you want. So I'm going to say this page was made in Flask. There we go. And then let's save that. And in app.py, I also want to import, from the same library which is Flask, I want to import render template. So render underscore template. And what this library does is it renders a certain template, and in this case that template will be index.html. So let's save that, and let's say we want to render this HTML file in the main root. So then instead of returning a text, let's render the HTML file. So render template again, that's what we imported. And I want to do index.html. And you don't have to have just one HTML file, you can have multiple, but just for simplicity I'm using one. And now this is all done. So now if we go to the default route, it should render this index.html, and that just has a h1 tag that says this page was made in Flask. So let's go back to terminal and stop running this, clear it, and then run server again. And then, let's copy that from terminal actually. So this is the IP address, and then let's go back to Chrome, paste it in, and then there we go. So we went to the default route, and it says this page was made in Flask, which is the index.html file. And it also says my web page as the title. And you can add whatever HTML you want, and it'll still show that here. And the other route still works also. So if we go to /Rishab, then it says, hi Rishab, how are you? So it still works. The next step is to make a variable in Python and then make that show up on our HTML page. So now we've rendered a simple HTML page that has an h1 tag, but let's say we want this h1 tag to change, and we can make that change in Python. So let's say I want to make a variable called header, let's say. And then we'll make that a string of, let's say, dynamic string, let's call that. But you can call it whatever you want. And then, in index.html, let's say we want this variable, whatever the value of this variable is, we want that to appear as the h1 tag. So how we can do that is by using Jinja 2, the templating language, like I talked about before. So we're going to use two curly braces, and then inside of that, header. And I called the variable in Python header, but you can call it whatever you want. And let's say you call it something else. You have to tell Python that this variable should be the same as this header in the h1 tag. So how we can do that is by adding a parameter here, which is header, which is this variable, equals header in the index.html. And now it should add, if we go to the default route, then it should appear as this index.html page, But in the h1 tag, it should say dynamic string. And we can actually change this. Let's say like Rishab we want to add. So let's go back to terminal. I'm going to stop this and run it again. And then go back to Chrome. And instead of /Rishab, let's go to that default page. And there we go, it says Rishab. And this is dynamically adding from Python to the HTML page. So we can actually change this to whatever we want. So hi there. And save that. And then go back, run it again. And then if we reload this page, then it should say hi there. And this is dynamically adding it into the index.html page from our Python file. There we go. So the next step after that is, instead of just one variable with a string value, we can make it an array. And instead of just adding this array as a string, we can make it a bulleted list. And each element in the array can be a certain list item. So let's do that. So instead of header, I'm going to call this shopping list. And the reason why is because I'm going to make this an array, and I want it to be a shopping list. But you can make any type of array. So let's say in the shopping list we want eggs, milk, and let's say oil. So we have 3 elements in our array, but you can add as many as you want. And in index.html, we want each of these elements to appear as a bullet point. So how we can do that is by using an unordered list. So I'm going to use the ul tag, which is unordered list, and then inside of that, instead of writing each list item as a separate element, I'm going to loop through each element and then add them as a list item. So how I can do that is by using Jinja2 again, and I'm going to say for item in shopping list, just like Python, except this is Jinja2, so it's a different templating language. So for item in shopping list, and then we're going to have a list item, and this one in the list item will have item. And each item is each element in the shopping list, like we said in the for loop here. And then for Ginger, you have to tell when the for loop has ended. So here I'll say end for, just so that it says it ends the for loop. So now for each item in this shopping list, it'll make a list item, and then inside of the list item, it'll have each item, which is each element in this array, which is shopping list. And then it'll end the for loop, and yeah. So instead of header equals header, as of this point, we don't even have a header variable anymore. So let's change this to shopping list. No. Shopping list equals shopping list. Because here we have shopping list variable, which is the array, and then we have the for loop, which is shopping list. And we can take out this. Let's just make this, let's just call this shopping list here as the h1 tag, because we don't have a header variable anymore. Although you could create multiple variables in your application. So let's take that dot out and save this. And then there we go. So let's just run this code. And then Flask run. Okay, it's running. And let's reload this page. And there we go. So it has our static shopping list text that we added. And for each, so let's go back to app.py. For each element in our array, it's giving it a different bullet point and dynamically adding that. So if we want, we could also add more values, and no matter how many values you add, it'll always add more and more bullet points. So let's say I wanted to add food coloring, and maybe cookies. Then if we save that, and then run it again, then if we reload this page, then there we go. See, no matter how many elements you add in the array, it just dynamically adds that into our HTML page. That worked! Thank you very much for attending this session. I hope you guys learned something new, or at least extended your knowledge on Flask using Python. If you want, feel free to support me on social media using these links. And thank you all very much for watching.